And we come to the last chapter of Beyond Innocence and Redemption, Confronting the Holocaust and Israeli Power, Creating a Moral Future for the Jewish People, now on its 30th anniversary. Hello, Professor Ellis.
Hello, Professor Coy.
And we have come to the final chapter.
Amazing, amazing.
Yeah, it's amazing. And also now I'm realizing how prophetic the book is, and how I think it should be revisited time and again.
Well, very intense book, no question, and revisiting it for me has been quite an effort, worthwhile effort, also trauma and hope, and everything in between.
Right, indeed. Okay, so let's start. Let's dive in. Okay, so the sixth chapter is Beyond Innocence and Redemption, and it's where you put everything together. Very important in the task ahead. And here you went back to the initial purpose of the book, which is the task of Jewish theology. And it's again reminding us that the theology defined as nurturing the questions that the people need to ask regarding the history that they are creating. So let me read that passage in chapter 6, the opening passage. With the narrow choices before the Jewish community, what does Jewish theology have to say at this most critical time? As we have seen, Irving Greenberg has written at length, yet his analysis seems impotent before the need to make a fundamental choice rather than a corrective maneuver. The framework of Holocaust theology itself mitigates against serious discussion and decision on the fundamental challenge before the Jewish people, to move beyond innocence and redemption and to realize the cost of empowerment. And what do other theologians who work in the shadow of Holocaust theologians, the progressive Jewish theologians like Arthur Waskow, have to contribute? Waskow's essential response to the uprising and the Israeli measures to repress it is that if one loves Israel, one should work to correct its policies. If one is given up on Israel, work for Jewish renewal in the United States. From other theologians, there is silence or tired repetition of old arguments. So in that passage that I read, you basically said that what we have now is one thing, at least at that time, and you singled out Arthur Waskow. What's your most important critique about Waskow's response?
Well, this was where I was journeying with other Jews confronting the uprising. And I realized then, although I articulated it somewhat later, that progressive Jewish theologians like Arthur Waskow and Michael Lerner were the left wing of Constantinian Judaism. That is, they thought they were in a civil war with the Jewish establishment, and they were in some ways. They were pushing the boundaries. But if you violated their boundaries, that is progressive Jewish boundaries on the Holocaust in Israel, you were tossed out, and they sided with the Constantinian Jewish establishment. Waskow and Lerner were more or less like cult figures in the Jewish community. They were very important in Jewish renewal. But if you met with them privately or were at meetings with them when other more basic measures were decided upon or discussed, you found that they pushed against more radical understandings and they basically were upholding the status quo. That is, they were in many ways enablers. They were critics of what Israel was doing, but they were also enablers of what Israel was doing. And I experienced this personally. But if you read Tikkun, Michael Lerner's Tikkun, which was an excellent journal in which I got a lot of material from, his editorials which went on and on and on. They were almost like books. You could see how paternalistic both Waskow and Lerner were toward Palestinians, and how they tried to uphold the boundaries that wouldn't move the issue forward for Jews. So they did a lot. They were important, but they were trying to hold the line. And they were not doing what we needed to do, and it wasn't going to go anyplace. They wanted a two-state solution finally, yes, but they wanted a wall between Israel and Palestine, or Jews and Palestinians. They wanted, in a sense, a Jewish return to innocence and a kind of redemption within Israel, within certain boundaries. But they wanted to be separated from the people we had displaced and that we were oppressing. And I saw that as a way of deflecting from a central point that we had reached, that we could not go forward without the victims of our empowerment. Now, that they weren't totally negative toward Palestinians, they were breaking new ground, but they also wanted to keep the lid on it. There was something that was about to explode within the Jewish uprising, within the Palestinian uprising. They were part of the Jewish uprising, but they also wanted to contain it. So they pushed Jews, dissenting Jews who were to the left of them out, and dissenting Christians who were beginning, they pushed them out. And therefore, and in some ways, my own sense is they wanted to become the next Jewish establishment. And I thought about that as a band, the next Jewish establishment.
Okay. Yes. Isn't that, I mean, is that maybe they were just being pragmatic? Don't you see it? That's probably, they don't want to go that far because, you know, it's also very political. So it might be better if it's, they would approach it in a more pragmatic way.
Well, you have two choices as any minority, but just talking about Jews, you can try to approach change within the Jewish community, keeping certain boundaries intact and being identifiable as Jews. So they started wearing kippahs, bigger glasses. They looked like they were in a library more, but they were dancing and they were doing Jewish renewal, the moon, and all of this stuff. Or you can, as a Jew, speak to the world, which gets back to the Jewish community in another way. So they believed that keeping the Jewish boundaries as they were, but expanding them a bit, would do the job. My own sense was, intuitive sense, but also analytical sense was, this was a way of deflecting what we had done. So for instance, Michael Lerner's son, which he trumpeted, joined the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. That was a big deal to prove his patriotism. And they became more and more religious and started religious rituals and all of this and to show how religiously Jewish they were. My sense was then, and even more so today, that that was the wrong move. And so even movements like Jewish Renewal, which they were a part of and was expanded, including many women, which had some wonderful liturgical understandings and expansions and the complete movement of women into the group as full equals. Although you notice that the men were very, very patriarchal feminists, which I noticed too. So this is a controversial point, but in 1990, I realized that they were a dead end, and they were. So they weren't being, you know, they did have a sense of, you know, what can we do practically? But what we could do practically wasn't enough. That's the point. And they meant practically within the Jewish boundaries that they said that they would uphold. Those
Yeah.
boundaries were hindering us.
Yeah, it's like when you talk about justice, on whose terms are you going to?
Yeah.
Uh,
So, since I was at a meeting with Waskow and others where a group of Jews and Christians wanted to start a movement that was very common in Central America at the time of witnessing within Israel, for instance, like in Nicaragua, as American Jews or as Jews, for the others who were being repressed and oppressed. And Waskow's view was we had to deal with the Israeli peace camp. That's how you did it. But the Israeli peace camp, while courageous in some ways, wasn't going anywhere either. So they were, my overall sense was that renewal movements try to keep a lid on the explosion that's needed. And they were two major factors, Lerner and Waskow, in keeping the lid on and also trying to convert the Jewish community. The Jewish community was not going to be converted. It wasn't going to happen, and I knew that.
yeah, I guess institutions are like that. They wanted to be relevant by being moderate. It's very much like the Catholic Church at the time of the martial law, when they tried to be more progressive. They were they have taken the anti-dictatorship stance, but at the same time they do not want the militant priests and nuns.
Right. It's
So
true in all movements. And so, there's good things and bad things. But if you look at the writing in Beyond Innocence and Redemption and you look at their writing, you can see at that time a vast difference. I don't go to religiosity in an overt way. I don't talk about recovering Jewish rituals. I don't talk about this kind of sacralization of Jewish. I talk about the need for a radical reevaluation.
state power. Okay. And here you try to um, emphasize, underscore again that what is needed is to confront the state power and the ideology or the theology behind it. So the argument really is not about the existence of Israel, which we have discussed in the first and second chapter, about that it's also a response to the Holocaust, the need for a land, for a need for a homeland for the Jewish people. That is not the issue, but the question of a Jewish state. So the argument is not about the existence of Israel, but the question of a Jewish state. What helps Jews rise in Israeli societies? What helps people to rise in many societies? What then is the context of the term Jewish in the title Jewish state? This is the crux of the matter, and why many Jews sense that normalization is hardly enough. And then you move on to the discussion of the self-determination. And that is, of course, a very complex issue. When we talk about state, we talk about the right to self-determination, your own land, your own constitution, etc. So in the Jewish context, it's very complex, and it has a twofold dimension, and that's sometimes contradictory in its rights on the terror. The desire to be free to define oneself and the renewal of Jewish spirit and culture. Ultimately, the quest for self-determination was and remains a historical one. What is the mission and witness of the Jewish people? What does it mean to be Jewish? Is Jewishness achieved best within an almost totally Jewish framework, or in an environment with others accepted in the personal and public arena as equals? And in terms of, so what kind of self-determination would it be? Should it be binational state or a Jewish state? Since when you talk about self-determination, the issue of pluralism is crucial, and you bring together, the question that Magnus, Buber, and Arendt brought up, that it's not whether Jews should live in Palestine, but how the community in Palestine is to be organized. Should it be a binational state with Jewish autonomy integrated into a larger pluralistic structure, or an exclusive Jewish state? And in which you says that, again, it brings out the question: are Jews essentially a ghetto people? So which side are you on, Professor Ellis?
Well, I may be on a lot of sides because it is a complex issue. What does it mean to be Jewish? Can we have a Jewish state? Since we have a Jewish state, what is that really? Since the state is not going to disappear. What is self-determination as Jews? I raise here a little bit, but I raise later the question of, are we in a diaspora if we don't have a Jewish state? Is it true if most Jews, 80% or more, live in Israel and in the United States, two empires, one Jewish, the other with Jews empowered? Do we really have a diaspora? Are we, for the first time in history, with a state that's failing as Jewish, but also without a diaspora? What does that mean? So there are a lot of questions. I reading back or having you read these passages from my book 30 years ago, I realized how, and I want to be clear that I don't ascribe this to me, but how prophetic and how far ahead of the time I was, and how so many of the questions being raised today lack the depth that you find in Beyond Innocence and Redemption. Of course, that's my view, since it's my book. But I'm reading, hearing you read these passages, which I wrote. Where did they come from? That's another question. And what do they mean now? But these questions of a Jewish state, diaspora, what does that mean if it's relevant anymore? What do we do with a state that is failing? 30 years later, the situation is a lot worse. A lot worse. The progressive Jewish establishment, people like Lerner and Waskow, is finished. It collapsed. There was no room for it anymore because their analysis completely failed. So we have now Constantinian Jews and what I call Jews of conscience. And Jews of conscience are frozen out completely now. We no longer have this kind of left wing of Constantinian Judaism, which progressive Jewishness was. What do we have now? And what does that mean in relation to the, quote, Jewish state that is failing even more, the diaspora that really exists even less, and Jews of conscience are in exile? One of the things that I've done with other writers is transpose their writing into Jewish terms sometimes, and it's an interest. Now it'd be interesting to take these texts that I wrote and how would I rewrite them within the basic framework? Because also my thought, when I say that progressive Jews failed, so do Jews of conscience. It wasn't clear to me in 1990, when this book was published, that we would fail completely. Although you can see seeds there. Now we know we failed completely. So we have to start writing these texts in a way again. But what do we say? When you reach a dead end, Waskow and Lerner were saying basically, like, try to correct Israel. It won't be corrected. And if you don't want to do that, try to renew Judaism in the United States. That's not political. That may be important to individuals like Christian liturgies are important to Christians, which is fine, but is that the end game of Jewish?
Yeah.
That we have rituals that we all enjoy or that we all participate in equally? Is that it?
Yeah,
Um,
I have to say that in the that this is really what I would call a real political theology. I mean, and I think that's my that's also my beef with what we have, what we call now political theologies, which basically you talk about justice, and but justice could be very ambiguous too, and without any concrete applications, and so. But here, talking about the state power, and as a theology, I find it really it is really a move that is a very direct a move from the from Jewish renewal, and just basic justice issues. It's really a moving forward to what is political.
right. Most political theology today that I read is not political. It's a heavy theoretical and sometimes very interesting and provocative, but it's not political. Beyond Innocence Redemption, written during the uprising, as I traveled around the world, including Israel, Palestine, many times, is a direct confrontation. Now, it also failed, I admit, but it's very strong in its political, its attempt to talk about Jewish in a political way and to find a way forward politically, which is important for theology. The other stuff was really, when you go into renewing traditions, you're regressing. It seems like you're progressing, but this is the same thing with Christian renewal. Christian renewal is a regression. Now, it could be very beautiful. There can be stuff that's really important. That's not my point. But when you get into renewal, you're finished politically.
And it's interesting because, uh, of course, I know that you have taken American studies, which is very political, but here you really think like, very much like Hannah Arendt in terms of political thinking. And I'm thinking, where, how did you get that? How did you arrive at all this? Because these are
Well, first,
very political.
thank you for the compliment. Hannah Arendt isn't very interesting as a philosopher in my point of view, but politically, in her writings, her blog posts, in a sense, in the 1940s, and even Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is an experiential, yeah, she's very interesting. And so I thank you for that compliment. Where did I get it? Well, that's an interest. I don't know. It's just Jewish.
Yeah.
Yeah, guys, I had a certain sense and have a certain sense of Jewish and the prophetic, of course. And were Jewish progressives prophetic? Well, they had all the trappings and they looked Jewish, and they began to, but it was a very nostalgic view. Much of Jewish renewal and diaspora Judaism, even today, is nostalgic. We were freed from that for so long. Hannah Arendt was freed. And of course, there is a renewed sense of Jewish after the Holocaust in Israel. So I'm not like Elber Berger, this kind of democratic, very American sense of individualism and all. I don't have that. That's gone, and that should be buried too. Reformed Judaism as it was. But the idea that Jews will be religious, more or less like Christians, I see, Tikkun and Moscow and all as a Christian incarnation of Jewish. And again, some very beautiful things. But in the end, you think, is my life as a Jew to be in some kind of synagogue, even if it's out in the woods? This is, this is like the evangelical, young evangelicals who started doing religious service with guitars and jeans. I prefer to wear jeans myself, but is this it? Is this the terminus of Jewish history? having a mikvah in a river where everyone gets naked, or hugging a tree, or dancing with the Torah. I'm look, I don't want to be. Here we are, ethnically cleansing a people, ghettoizing them, and you want me to dance around with the Torah?
Don't you think it's part of the liturgy of destruction, which we talked about a couple of chapters ago?
Yeah, I just said when I first met Waskow and Lerner, I thought to myself, we've got to get serious. There's something wrong here. And this is why Beyond Innocence and Redemption is so distinctive. It's not me. It's my working out what is going on with us. And it's eclectic and it's eccentric. I got it. So you read that book now and ask me who is right, who is wrong. You let history judge. Now, it's not because I knew I was right. That's not my point. And it doesn't mean that I won the day. I didn't. But Beyond Innocence and Redemption is right. It's right on the mark. And if we had taken this road, things would be a lot better. And if we took the Tikkun and the Waskow road, we wouldn't have gotten any place. Now, we also didn't get any place with the road I paved out there either. So we have to be generous. You asked me my view, and this is a conversation about my losers. But sometimes the question is how you go down. Sometimes the question is, what is your witness in history? And later on, I developed this understanding, an image of helicopter gunships, Star of David helicopter gunships in the Ark of the Covenant. I don't want to dance with that Torah. I don't want to. If we're going to oppress and ghettoize a people, I don't want to dance.
Okay. All right. Let's. So I mentioned about how politically oriented this chapter is, actually the entire, the entire book, but especially this particular chapter, try to bring the what is really at stake here and what is so important. And let me read this, and this is your way forward. The way forward is not to abandon the dialectic that Holocaust theology poses or to skirt it, but to reassert and broaden it, to see Holocaust and empowerment as ways of connecting Jews to the world rather than isolating them from it. It is to see ourselves as Jews in history rather than simply creating a Jewish history. The question of survival and the assertion of Jewishness, as articulated by Wiesel and Greenberg, takes second place to the quality of Jewish witness. In a sense, this is to restate the obvious. As Jews, we are in history with others, and Jewish particularity should be a sign of affirmation to ourselves and to others as well. Okay, and then we how do we move forward with that being in history with others? You basically point to this hidden tradition of being a pariah, and of course that when we talk about the Jew as a pariah, that immediately brings to mind Hannah Arendt's essay on the Jew as pariah. And here I quote from that although this this was also in the Jewish writings and part of the introduction by Ron Feldman on the case of Hannah Arendt, the Jew as pariah. So for Arendt, the pariahs did the most for the spiritual dignity of their people, who were great enough to transcend the bounds of nationality and to weave the strands of their Jewish genius into the general texture of European life. Those bold spirits who tried to make of the emancipation of the Jews that which it really should have been, an admission of the Jews as Jews to the ranks of humanity. Okay, before we continue with Hannah Arendt's hidden tradition, you said that this hidden tradition is actually what is needed in in, um, uh, involvement in history. Can you talk more about that, Professor Ellis?
Now, the Jew as pariah is, of course, very important, Hannah Arendt's understanding. But of course, she also had that understanding pre-state. So this is where the Jewish prophetic was outward toward European civilization and critiquing governments and economics and psychology. We have Freud, Marx, and all of these great Jewish thinkers, Kafka, and many others, including Hannah Arendt, who are using their intellect, but also their grounding in Jewishness, even if it is secular, in a very secular way, sharing with others a very Jewish critique, often not even naming it as Jewish. So it's kind of a hidden tradition. And but now, and this is where Hannah Arendt recedes a bit, we have a recovery of Jewishness in a way that Hannah Arendt didn't know it and didn't experience it after the Holocaust and the state of Israel, and within the context of the 67 war. And now we have to ask a question. Actually, I'm pointing here, and I'm glad you read this text, to Jews of conscience, which I hadn't named in Beyond Innocence and Redemption. She's really talking about Jews of conscience in her time and others in history that she's recalling. And now I'm beginning to raise the question, without naming it here, about Jews of conscience in our time, within the context of the naming of the Holocaust, because she lived through and after, but it had only really been named in the 1967 war. She was already off the Jewish scene by then, actually pushed off or bludgeoned off by the Jewish establishment. What does it mean to be Jewish, the hidden tradition now? And that's another challenge. It isn't completely different than Hannah Arendt, but it's taking Jewish particularity much more seriously. And again, the prophetic has come home. Hannah Arendt has that dimension when she's writing about Palestine. In her philosophy, she doesn't. Now my sense is that our world, our Jewishness has narrowed in an explosive way as the prophetic has come home. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the hidden tradition now? It can't be a universal critique. That is important. But Jews who have a universal critique, as I said in our last conversation, without emphasizing the particularity of Jewishness, are also deflecting. So I would say there's been a passing of the torch in a way from Hannah Arendt, and that's a difficult torch to pass, but it has to be, because she had the universal, but her most important writing and her strongest writing was on Jewish particularity, which she didn't affirm. She just said, I'm Jewish, let it go. Don't talk to me about what does it mean. I'm just Jewish. And people who criticized her as not identifying Jewish, she said, it's a given.
Yeah, I think that she emphasized that Jewishness is a given.
Yeah, Jewishness is a given, but no, that's not true now. It's a given that needs to be explored. Hannah Arendt didn't consciously explore her Jewishness, although she was so Jewish. That's the beauty of Jewish universalism. But Hannah Arendt is impossible now because Jewish particularity has come home.
What do you mean that it is difficult now to say that Jewishness is given?
because it needs to be explored and carried in another way. You know, every generation of Jews has to understand what it means to be faithful as a Jew. She's outlining it, and she had both her contribution to others and her specific focus on Palestine. So she had both. But the Jewish particularity was just a given for her. Now, after the Holocaust has been named and Israel has been named as central, and with the devolution of Israel, the continuing devolution of Israel, it needs to be named in another way. And that's just understandable. Generations have different. So who's the heir to Hannah Arendt? If we could talk about that. Jews of conscience. But if Jews of conscience act in the world as Hannah and think in the world as Hannah Arendt did, they're not up to the task now. It doesn't mean that she was deficient. She was faithful as a Jew in her time. What does it mean to be faithful as a Jew in our time? Beyond Innocence and Redemption points that way, in my view. So Hannah Arendt is important, and we need to move beyond her, not because she was insufficient, but because we're in a different context. We have a, she's living and writing when a state hasn't yet been named. Now it has not only been named, but fully empowered. She has a sense of a binational possibility. That's gone in the way that she talked about it. So our fidelity and our Jewish particularity needs to be explored in another way. Going back to Lerner and Waskow, they were trying to explore it, but in a way that, in my view, is insufficient. They were glossing over at the center of Jewish fidelity today.
Yeah. Okay. So Hannah Arendt's description of a hidden tradition of being a pariah is you take a boundary position, which is not totally, in her time, she doesn't really identify herself as German, but more as Jewish. And at the same time,
no, she identifies fully as European and then American, but she's Jewish. And the question is, you know, Jews are always going to be pariahs. There are going to be Jews who are pariahs within a broader society and within Jewish life. That's the prophetic. That's the essence. That's our indigenous. And she did it in her own way at that time, and the way she knew it and the way she experienced it. We have to do that in our time, the way we know it and the way we experience it. This is not completely different, but there are fundamental differences that are important. So, you know, it's just like with Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker. Some people, Catholics, say, I want to be like Dorothy Day. You can't be. Dorothy Day was raised in a certain way and experienced a certain time. You can take her witness and ask, what is your witness? But to go back to Hannah Arendt or even to Buber or Benjamin is a kind of a nostalgia, not because they're nostalgic, but because we're in a different place.
okay. So is being a pariah means that you have that disinterested intelligence, you know, that you can see things in a broader way. And although she took a stance.
Oh, totally. Oh, and she was vilified for her stands on the binational state and later on Eichmann, which was interpreted both as anti-Semitic or self-hating Jew by the Jewish establishment. And by the 67 war, she had been silenced. So that was it for her. She just gave up on Jewish life.
Well, Hannah Arendt died in 1975. And so that's actually, so she had lived after the 67 war, but she no longer.
She had almost no comments Jewishly after the trauma that her reporting on the Eichmann trial did. So she, in a sense, gave up. Now, whether if she had lived longer, if she would have re-entered. See, all of these folks that are very important in Jewish history are also dated by context. Abraham Joshua Heschel, too, died in 72. What would he have said if he had lived into the 1980s in the bombing of Beirut and during the Palestinian Uprising? We don't know.
Mhm.
Some of these people, great Jewish thinkers, are lucky that they did die early, that they didn't experience this. This is a much more difficult situation, or maybe a much more impossible situation than they faced. And they faced, I mean, impossible. Maybe we always face impossible situations. So the question of the prophetic in Jewish life is, what do you do as you are always in an impossible situation, which changes at different times? They were in an impossible series of impossible situations. We are too. Don't try to reform them. It isn't going to work. That's my view. And Jewish renewal tries to reform.
Okay. All right. So let's look at what she has to say about the nationalism. Um, and this is from the book, from the article she wrote on Zionism Reconsidered. Nationalism is bad enough when it trusts in nothing but the rude force of the nation. This is her criticism of Jewish nationalism. A nationalism that necessarily and admittedly depends upon the force of a foreign nation is certainly worse. This is the threatened fate of Jewish nationalism and of the proposed Jewish state, surrounded inevitably by Arab states and Arab peoples. Even a Jewish majority in Palestine, nay, even a transfer of all Palestine Arabs, which is openly demanded by revisionists, would not substantially change the situation in which Jews must either ask protection from an outside power against their neighbors or come to a working agreement with their neighbors. Those who are dismayed at the spectacle of national movement that, and she was talking about Zionism, starting out with such an idealistic elan, sold out at the very first moment to the powers that be, that felt no solidarity with other oppressed peoples whose cause, though historically otherwise conditioned, was essentially the same, that endeavored, even in the morning dream of freedom and justice, to compromise with the most evil forces of our time by taking advantage of imperialistic interests. Those who are dismayed should, in fairness, consider how exceptionally difficult the conditions were for the Jews, who, in contrast to other peoples, did not even possess the territory from which to start their fight for freedom. The alternative to the road that Herzl marked out and Weizmann followed through the bitter end would have been to organize the Jewish people in order to negotiate on the basis of a great revolutionary movement. This would have meant an alliance with all progressive forces in Europe. It would certainly have involved great risk. The only man within the Zionist organization known to have ever considered this way was the great French Zionist Bernard Lazare, the friend of Charles Pigalle, and he had to resign from the organization at the early date of 1899. From then on, no responsible Zionists trusted the Jewish people for the necessary political strength of will to achieve freedom instead of being transported to freedom. Thus, no official Zionist leader dared to side with the revolutionary forces in Europe. Instead, the Zionists went on seeking the protection of great powers, trying to trade it against possible services. They realized that what they could offer must conform to the interests of governments. Now, I quoted this at length because I wanted you to comment, because later on you would talk about the coalition of Messianic trust. And back then this was written in the 1940s. Hannah Arendt was talking about alliance with the revolutionary forces in Europe. And she said that Herzl and Weizmann missed that opportunity and instead succumbed to to powers like Britain and later on to the United States. So, what's her idea of an alliance actually? How would you assess that? Was that possible at the
Well, here
time?
Arendt is quite political. You know, again, I separate her German philosophy in America and her politics and her insight into Palestine. And the Jewish side of her, which is the great side of her, is much more incisive and direct. And, you know, it's a very interesting passage that I quote and you read, because she, you know, there were a lot of people, or some, depending on, we didn't have polls at the time, who thought that the Jewish struggle for its own independence was revolutionary. There were people who recognized that as a revolutionary movement, rather than as a colonial movement. Because Jews were oppressed, and this is where, you know, we have to understand history. And but so she wanted Jews and what became the state. She didn't want a Jewish state, but the Jewish empowerment within Palestine, which she wanted to be binational, she thought should have linked with other revolutionary forces. And there were some, but the leadership, which leadership does in general, tended to go toward the imperial powers like Britain and say, how can you help us? We can do this and that for you if you do this and that for us. Now, it's important to realize that everybody always, on any side, appeals to imperial and colonial powers because they have power. So for instance, today, if Palestinians could be rescued by the United States, they would accept it, and they should. Now, what would that mean to their internal society? That's another question. But everybody appeals to colonial and imperial powers, and that should not be a critique that is leveled often today because everybody appeals to it, that kind of power. On the other hand, what Hannah Arendt is pointing out is once you do that,
Yeah.
the hopes that you have of achieving, which she thought was Jewish education, Jewish agriculture, and as this Jewish society within Palestine as a contribution to the broader world, would be decimated. This is where Hannah Arendt is very, very precise. She said, if you choose that way, which they did,
Yeah.
we're dead in the water. You're going to have a militarized society forever because you're going to have to push out the Arabs of Palestine. You're going to have to keep them out. You're going to have to keep the Arab world out. You're going to have to identify with power that will give you the force to do that. And you'll also militarize Jewish. This is
Yeah.
again where
In that
Jewish,
sense, she was very prophetic.
very prophetic. It's exactly what happened. And you get she didn't use this term, I developed it, the arrival of Constantinian Judaism. Now, she also recognized throughout Jewish history that there were powerful Jews who sought to define what Jewish was. So in a sense, she recognized Constantinian Jews, but she had no idea, although she experienced it over the Eichmann book, some on the binationalism, but increasingly as Constantinian Judaism became stronger, she was hit full on by that.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. But I was thinking, what was she? What was she talking about? What organization or what was she thinking about when you say European revolutionary forces? Wasn't this the the because European Jewry was decimated? Oh
right,
no, this was still in the 1940s.
yeah.
This
Well,
was after the Holocaust, right? So was she still optimistic about Europe at that time?
well, the revolutionary forces in Europe were also losers. I think this is the point. Revolutionary forces lose. Now, they also may bring the ball up the field a bit, but in a sense, they always lose out to power, and they negotiate with power. Now, how do you develop a state in that, you're going to lose, but you negotiate with power. And the Jewish leaders of communities are entrusted with the empowerment of their people. They're going to choose empowerment and the allies that will help them. Then they become an elite. For instance, in the United States, you have a Black elite. You'll have a Latino elite. You'll have a Muslim elite. You have all sorts of elites who believe that by identifying with power, they will help themselves first, but they'll also help their people. Then the question within these constructs, these communities, Black, Latino, and feminists, we're going to have a Secretary of State, I think, maybe, who's a woman, and we have all of these women being promoted, which is good, but what does that mean? So they're allying with power. They think it's good for women, and other women will benefit from it, and then you'll have women who say, I don't want it. And this is true within Jewish too. So people accuse people like Hannah Arendt of being naive. She was very specific, but the revolutionary forces in Europe is a naivete. You can't build a state like that, but she didn't want a state to be built. So she was warning, if you go this route, this is what will happen. Now, did they have any other route to go? That's a different question.
Yeah,
The revolutionary
the
forces,
question is, are there
yeah,
other options at that time?
not to build a state, my own sense. And even the reconsideration of German money and goods that went on in Israel during and after the Eichmann trial, there were Jews who didn't want that power of Germany to fund Israel because of what Germans had done to Jews. That's a big and of course the state decided to take that support, military support, funds, money, billions of dollars and all, because they wanted to build the state. They thought the state was more important than Jewish ethics, and that's why they could also displace Palestinians and essentially ghettoize Palestinians in a permanent occupation, because that was better for the state. Well, Hannah Arendt is saying, well, maybe better for a state, but what does a state mean? It's going to end everything we've given to the world. But Jewish leaders aren't interested in what Jews give to the world. They're interested in Jewish empowerment or Black empowerment or women empowerment or wherever you go. So the prophetic, like Hannah Arendt, is always going to be a pariah. And she became a pariah in the Jewish community, even though she thought she was laying out the groundwork for another possible Jewishness in a new context.
Well, I think that's well, that is not that insight is really that's very much that's historically true anywhere, that when you want change, it's really about power. I mean, you cannot really appeal to ethical.
Well,
Um,
I mean, even if you go look at the academy with all of these very radical thinkers who appealed for money to foundations, where did the foundations get the money? Or if you're teaching at Harvard or all of these schools that are based on slave money and all sorts of imperial money and government money that funds the CIA and all sorts of weaponry. So
yeah.
we all, there's
The
no
thing,
purity.
but the thing is, we all want a radical change, revolutionary change, transformative change, substantive. But and all of that takes really, you take your ethical stance seriously, but nobody would do that because it's just not gonna work. At the end of the day, what is needed is you have to get things done, and that needs power.
Yeah. Well, and we negotiate with it in all of our lives, but the hypocrisy is clear. It's not just Jewish hypocrisy, but what Hannah Arendt saw so wonderfully and importantly was this would be the end of everything if you go that route. And she was right. Now, was there another route to take? That's a different issue. Would her route have worked? Probably not. What does it mean? We don't even know now as Jews what it means to live without a state. Whatever our view is on Israel, none of us know what it is to live without Jewish empowerment. She knew, we don't know. That changes everything. And Jews are quite comfortable in empowerment because we need the protection of the state. That's another point that I don't get to in Beyond Innocence and Redemption, but the ambivalence toward Jews, obviously the Holocaust, but remaining today, can Jews live outside of an empowered reality? And how do Jews maintain their empowerment? We're such a small minority by linking with various power. And then there are groups, Jews of conscience, who want to link with these revolutionary forces that Hannah Arendt talks about.
But
But
why these
they
revolutionary forces and not with the Palestinians or
you mean Hannah
why?
Arendt?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they're during the uprising, as I recall in Beyond Innocence and Redemption, there were Jewish groups that were directly linking with Palestinian groups, and both those groups lost. The Palestinian groups lost, and the Jewish Israeli groups lost, but there were attempts to link. So these attempts to link, I think, are really negotiating tactics with power. And you can get some things and you don't get others. And sometimes you can get basically murdered, and yet the witness lives on. So plenty of hypocrisy, but Hannah Arendt is right on what happened, but what could have happened, who knows?
That's right. Okay. Um, so let's move to Buber, another figure who is looking at history from that boundary position of the hidden tradition. Like Arendt, and this is I'm reading from your book, like Arendt, Buber maintained a dialectical tension between Jewish and European culture. Though Buber's dialectic involves greater immersion in the Jewish community, however, even within the Jewish community, Buber maintained another subtle yet sometimes overt distance. His critical Zionism within Israel, lived over 3 decades, is one example. But theological and liturgical matters also play their role. The ironic quality of his position within the Jewish community is found here. The most famous religious Jew in the world hardly set foot inside a synagogue. This is very interesting. So here, Buber, in terms of his position within the Jewish community, also exemplifies that hidden tradition.
Yeah, you have to love outrageous and courageous Jews like Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber. I have a deep love for this part of my tradition, the prophetic. And Buber, even when he was invited to give a talk in a synagogue, he would wait in the service. He might be given the sermon. He would wait until it was his time to speak, to walk into the synagogue, and then he would leave. So this is a whole thing about Buber's religiosity, which was outside of mainstream Judaism. Hannah Arendt was way outside of mainstream Judaism too, because they were dealing with Jewish, and Judaism is a subset of a Jewish, sometimes a major one for some and others way, way down the line. And Buber and Hannah Arendt were very different because Hannah Arendt had no sense of Jewish religiosity that can be identified, at least overtly. And Buber developed basically his own sense of Jewishness, which Jews do, like Hannah Arendt, but they were one-off prophetic figures. But they were both against a Jewish state. Now, here are two of the most famous Jews in the world, with Einstein, who was also against. So those are three. that I can think of right now. The three most famous Jews in the world, I think, Einstein, Buber, and Hannah Arendt at that time, and who all had experienced parts of the Holocaust. Hannah Arendt escaped through Europe. Buber was forced out of Germany. He went to Jerusalem. Einstein ended up in New Jersey. So they all experienced the Holocaust, but they weren't naive about power against Jews, not at all. They'd experienced it. But they were against the creation of a Jewish state because they thought the Jewish witness was something different than a state. In effect, they were all saying, are you kidding me? Are we going to become like the other nations? This goes back to the biblical. They didn't use that phraseology, but that's what they're doing. They're saying Jews are distinctive. They have different ways that Jews are distinctive in their view, but certainly we don't want to become like the others. If we have a state, all states are organized in certain ways about power, military, economy, and all, but we don't want that. We have a different witness in the world, and Buber had a wonderful, beautiful witness to the world within Palestine and then Israel. So he was right in the center of it. And he was also very bold. Not only did he write, but he also he was so well known, he would have meetings with prime ministers of Israel and chastise them. I mean, in front of them, not just in writing, not just, from a table in an office. So Buber was very strong. If you read his writings, again, on religion, he can be very esoteric. It's sort of like, very German, like Hannah Arendt on philosophy. You think, by the way, where are we? But when he talks about what's going on within Palestine and Israel, he can be very direct, and including calling out prime ministers, the first prime ministers of Israel, very directly. So wonderful part of the Jewish tradition. And again, the context has changed, but they give us a foundation. If you look at Hannah Arendt and Buber in a kind of a secular and then more religious sense, it can give us some foundations for Jews of conscience today within our own context.
Yes. Now Buber is famous for his philosophy of I and thou, and although that is, you might find that that's quite, mystical and all, but actually that also has a concrete concrete impact, concrete manifestation. For example, you talk about in your book when he received that, when he received when he was asked to speak, and he had to travel to Germany, and he had to speak very strongly about what the Germans did. But at the same time, he was very, he tried to reach out. He never closed the door.
Well, Hannah Arendt didn't either. I mean, they were Germans who believed in the beauty of German culture that had been perverted. They were both controversial because, remember, Hannah Arendt had Martin Heidegger as her lover when she was young. And she went to visit him afterwards, and Heidegger had become a Nazi. So, this was a very controversial. So these Jews, if you bring up an interesting point about Hannah Arendt and Buber. I mean, there were some German Jews who went to Israel who survived the Holocaust who would never speak German again. They wouldn't go to Germany. So it was very controversial both for her to visit Martin Heidegger in Germany and Buber to go to the Frankfurt Book Fair where he received a prize for his work. And he writes, and again, both Hannah Arendt and Buber on Jewishness are very wonderful, even though they're both known for their kind of universal political, philosophical, and theological kind of work. But when you look at their writings on Jews, particularly on Jewish, it can be very deep. And so, yeah, Buber said, look, for those who didn't want what happened to Jews when he went to Germany, he said, for those who didn't want to happen, to those who actively opposed, I'm with you. And to those who didn't know what to do, I also understand that. Look at the situation. To those who actively participated, I want nothing to do with you. It was very strong if you look at his address, which I quote in Beyond Innocence and Redemption. So he wasn't just saying, hey, let's forget it. And she wasn't either.
Yeah, and then that
She,
was, I think, very interesting because that's very different from, when you talk about forgiveness. So that's very different. It's really calling out those who should be accountable, and
but
it's not an
create accountability, which Jews became less and less able to do. And of course, now we're in a situation where Jews are enablers of the destruction of Palestine, and people want to know where we are. And it's complex, isn't it? Now, this is not to make a comparison or an excuse, but both Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber understood that the situation was not black and white, even though we want to think it is, of good and evil and wonderful people and terrible people, and the terrible people should be punished. And when it came to the punishment of Adolf Eichmann, again, Hannah Arendt and Buber were very controversial and very interesting, but they laid it out there. They weren't trying to hide. And they also wanted some kind of engagement and reconciliation with justice, but they both were very aware of where Jews were heading, which was to a no man's land. So they had these dimensions. They were wonderful thinkers. And of course, they were also, as I pointed out in one of our previous conversations, quite German, quite European. And they had the same prejudices that Germans and Europeans have, both about the force of the German tradition and the intellectual tradition. They were very proud of that. And the sense of superiority of Europe over other peoples. And the idea, though, that they would now use Jewishness and their Europeanness to help others. So sort of very much like the Vatican II Church came from a triumphalism to a serving all. Anyway, that was their context.
yeah.
But to condemn European Jews and to see them as white, which is what is very common today, is wrong. European Jews were not considered white by Europeans. And Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber, who were both forced out of Nazi Germany, knew that quite well.
You always say that about the European Jews were not white. Why do you think that there is uh, why do you think that people don't no longer think about that? Because the Jews are basically empowered. Is that why?
Well, they project back, and there are Jews who feel this too, but they're wrong. They don't understand Jewish history or the ambivalence toward Jews that remains. Jews have a very complex history within Europe, of course. That's not at issue. There's no question it's complex. But the idea that Jews were accepted in Europe as Europeans, there were some times and in some places that was true. But if you look at the broad sweep of European history, they were not. So we don't want to project now from Jewish empowerment. We have a very superficial, in my view, a very superficial understanding of Jewish history, including among some Jews who don't think through Jewish history and don't think through their own position within Jewish history because they benefit from Jewish empowerment, the same Jewish empowerment they critique. Again, these Jews who have that critique, very important critique, very interesting critique, very informative critique, benefit from Jewish empowerment in the imperial constellations of Israel and America. Even those Jews who come to the United States and critique it, which they should, but I think my own sense is they're trying to do something which cuts corners on Jewish history.
Uh,
So
well, thinking about, yeah, I understand ambivalence toward Jews, and the anti-Semitism is still there, but really, there will, I think, will always be ambivalence and discrimination and the treatment of Jews in a negative way. But that really, with what happened historically and where Jews are now, as you said, in power, is there really a threat that another Holocaust would happen? Or
no, I'm not talking about that, but again, think about it. Let's think. You have 13, 14, 15 million Jews in the world, and you have a huge percentage living in America, Canada, and Israel. And you say to the Polish government, look, we want to diversify. We're going to send 2 or 3 million Jews to Poland. What do you think would happen there? Or Austria? Or Thailand? Or the Philippines? What do we have to ask the question, without getting into eternal anti-Semitism, which Hannah Arendt argued against. Not can individuals, Jews, live in wherever, but where can millions of Jews live? Now think about it. The Germans who say to me, oh, we would love more Jews. Okay, I have a plan. We're going to get these Boeing, not the new Boeing jets, but the old ones. We're going to send 3 million Jews to Germany. Let's see how that works out. Now, I'm not being pessimistic, but I'm asking, we have to ask the question. Or France. How
yeah,
about 3
and
million Jews in France? And or
yeah,
about England?
because I even hear some Jews, let's say, that one of the safest place for a Jew to live now would be Germany.
That's true, and they're not European Jews, they're mostly Russian Jews. But they're also a contained community, and there's a lot of, it's complex in Germany, but they do live freely, and there are a lot of Israeli Jews who escaped from Israel to Germany. I understand that, so it's complex. I'm just saying, when you get into millions and millions of Jews, you ask where they can live safely. And I use the example of Poland, that has a very complex history, some of it very interesting and good toward Jews, and some of it awful. But if you say to Poland, if you want to resettle Jews outside of empire, of course, Poland would like to be part of the empire too, right? Every nation wants to be. And some people believe in Europe that having Jews would be good for the economy, good for culture, and all of that, and they do. But I'm talking about millions of Jews, and I just think it's time to give it up and understand that there's an ambivalence about Jews in history, which doesn't mean death camps. Even the romanticization of Jews. Is it really about Jews? So I don't want to be pessimistic, and I don't want to only be realistic, but I can't only talk about the prophetic. It isn't a mistake that Hannah Arendt, Albert Einstein ended up in, and Abraham Joshua Heschel ended up in the United States. It's not a mistake. And Buber ended up in Palestine. That's not a mistake either. Now, there are all sorts of bad things about that and good things and everything in between. But you have to ask yourself, not only for the prophetic Jews, but Jews in great numbers. Wherever Jews in great numbers congregate, there are questions about the Jewishness that's happening. Now, there are other groups that have their own beefs about blacks, women, Asian Americans, and all. So everyone has their own thing. But minority groups tend to do best in small numbers in certain areas of certain countries at certain times. And they can do well there. But when you broaden it out to a broader culture, there are other questions that come into being. And Jewish is the longest and deepest ambivalence.
Yeah. So this is a question that I think maybe uh, it will it will be mentioned later, but I'll ask it now. So, for example, in the state of Israel, and you said that pluralism is an important part of self-determination of the state. So, are you saying that, and this is probably wrong, that there could be a Jewish state where the majority, predominantly Jewish, but it's open for a minority who are non-Jews?
Yes, this is also very complex now that we have a state, a Jewish state. What does that mean? We go back to this question. And there are others who say we don't want a Jewish state or a state that identifies as Jewish at all. Okay, fine, but we have one. And you say that it's best, and I would say it's best for Jews and Palestinians to live together. Yes. How do you do that? How do you build in protections for Jews and for Palestinians? Maybe one day there won't need to be protections. That's true too. But you have to, when you do a political theology, you have to, especially about Jews. Now, there are other minorities in the world that have their own political theologies that need to be negotiated. So we're just talking about Jews here. But the ambivalence about Jews carried around the world by Christianity and Islam and in modernity is permanent. A few days ago, yesterday, and then the last few weeks, I've seen posts on Facebook by progressive Christians that quote about Judas and Jesus. And there was a discussion about whether Trump supporters should be offered reconciliation. And one of the people put, well, even, Jesus and Judas, he offered him bread. Well, when you think of Judas, what do you think of? You think of Jews. Well, Jesus was Jewish too. You said,
Yeah.
and the very
and everyone in the Gospels
not
basically Jews.
This is not how liturgically Christians think of it. Liturgically, they think of as Jesus is a Christian who was turned in by a Jew, and Jews as the cheaters for money and all. This is as far as we can tell, a permanent part of world culture. So when I hear Judas, and when a Christian hears Judas, we both hear Jews.
Yeah,
Now,
and you think about the conspiracy and the money.
Yeah, Jews as conspirators, all this stuff comes from that. So I want to say, let's put a quash on Judas forever. Just don't mention Judas. Please, just don't mention that anymore. But it's part of the gospel story. It's going to be read in church liturgy. So,
and it's in the canon. Yeah.
It may be that all peoples, all minorities need special protections. Okay. Jews need it too. Now, how do we get that without without enabling empire and being students of empire and corrupting ourselves? Very difficult, maybe impossible. But the prophetic has to not only recognize the faults, but recognize the needs of the people. And what I'm saying is, and I was at a conference in Turkey where a person who's a Palestinian, who's quite a figure, mapped out where millions of Jews could go in the Arab world. And I looked at that map. It was a very detailed map of millions of Jews. And I thought to myself, my God, where does he live? Well, he lives in Turkey because he was thrown out of the United States for being a Palestinian activist and all of that. He's had it rough, and I respect him. Good person. But, with jet lag and everything, looking at this map, I thought to myself, I've gone to another realm. Not because Arabs are anti-Semitic. This is not my point. Or that all Europeans are anti-Semitic. That's not my point. When you have millions of Jews, you're going to have this ambivalence. It's built in now to world history. What do you do with it? Now, that's a question for Jews and for others. And the answer is you negotiate it. Now, when you negotiate it, do you also oppress others? That appears to be the case. What do you do with that? So it's very complex. It's much more complex than saying I'm an anti-Zionist. What does that mean? Now, what does it mean? It's a theoretical statement. Okay, now I'm, as my kids say, I'm yelling.
No, no. We're just discussing. Okay, so let's continue with our discussion on the hidden tradition. The last person that you mentioned here uh, under the hidden tradition is Walter Benjamin. Of course, very much close to Hannah Arendt, a friend of Hannah Arendt. And this is a very famous quote from Walter Benjamin about the angel of history. But you said there's a difference between Benjamin and Arendt and Buber in terms of their own position about Jewish history. Can you elaborate on that, Professor Ellis?
Well, there's similarities. Of course, they're all German Jews. And Benjamin also has a very special place as a kind of a failure that Hannah Arendt rescues and now has become almost a cult celebrity on the left.
Oh, yeah.
But if you read his biography, it's really sad the way it ended. And he was also hit by the Nazis. But he had a theological bent that wasn't like Hannah Arendt, who didn't, and Martin Buber, who did. And to distinguish the three is very interesting. But Benjamin was a good friend of Gershom Scholem, as Hannah Arendt was at least friendly with him until they had this brouhaha over her Jewishness.
Yeah, the falling out. Yeah.
Yeah, falling out, yeah. And I don't know how close they were, I can't remember, but Scholem, another German Jew who went to Palestine and became an authority on Jewish mysticism, was trying to get Benjamin to come to Palestine, which may have rescued him, but he wasn't interested. So very German intellectual, very prophetic, and who didn't survive the Nazis. His sense about history and progress is very, very important, and is even more important today as really a storm that the debris of progress is going to bury us. And of course, and Buber had the sense too in I and Thou, the exponential increase of the it world. Now, it's very interesting that both of them had this sense way back when, before the internet and before the big shopping malls and before all the junk. There was enough junk there that they saw the end of civilization. This is in the 1930s and 40s, and it wasn't only the war. They were talking about modernity. So their critique of modernity was Benjamin and Hannah Arendt in her own way, and Buber was very prophetic. They understood where the world was going, and it wasn't a good place. And Benjamin may have captured it, and did capture it in a very wonderfully poetic, philosophical way, which hints at theology that can't be really spoken, but there's something beyond the secular. Buber had that sense too and developed his own religious language. Hannah Arendt didn't have it in that way. She had her own language. So this triumvirate. Now, in other words, Benjamin also was a non-Zionist at best. So we get Einstein, Hannah Arendt, Buber, and Benjamin, four of the most quoted and followed and known Jews of the 20th century. And they're all more or less against, or very much against, state Zionism. And very few Jews know about their stances or their philosophy or their theology.
Yeah. And they might be horrified, Arendt and Buber, Benjamin, they might be horrified to know that, some people would use their works uh, to conform to power.
Well, since we're in an empowered, Jews are, yeah, of course. And, you in the academic world, you get them quoted all the time, especially Benjamin in, the last years. And you wonder, you forget they're Jewish, their Jewishness is excised. Hannah Arendt's, Buber's, and Benjamin's often, but that's where it came from. They were very European and very universal, but their most beautiful writing was on this specific kind of Jewish sensibility, which is often not communicated by people who are writing academic articles or books. So they experience the fate of all people who become really well known. You wonder who they're talking about, the people who are using them sometimes, and sometimes they're written about beautifully too. And but they can become lost to history. They're part of the hidden tradition of Jewishness, of Jewish. They're not Christians. They're not Muslims. They're Jewish. You can't understand them. And then the tradition continues. There's someone like Dylan, and I talked about this before, Leonard Cohen. These are in the same tradition, which is maybe being lost now. Maybe it's was a contextual tradition that lasted a long time and came to fruition at a certain time in history. And in our empowerment will be lost. I'm trying to recover these voices so that they can remain within the known Jewish tradition or become known in the Jewish tradition of dissent. And not just place them as interesting European or academic philosophers. Benjamin died on the border trying to escape the Nazis. I mean, these people were, these were not, he didn't have an office that he was, typing up, sending by email the article.
These are Jews on the run, as you would say.
These were Jews on the run, all of them. And Benjamin died with that thesis, the philosophy of history, in his briefcase. So
maybe that's the condition that led to this, this hidden tradition of being a pariah. That they were on the, they were not powerful or privileged Jews. They were, as you said, they were on the run.
Well, they had different backgrounds and different positions, but in essence, they were on the run in the final analysis. And there's no real Jewish theology that's done that's worth it, in my view, if you're not on the run in some way. And the question, Beyond Innocence and Redemption, is on the run.
Okay, all right. So now we move to another topic and another section in the book, and this is this is about these four Christians who you bring into the conversation too, in terms of how do we move forward in history together with others, and this would be the others, and especially the work of these four Christian theologians. One is, and I'll read the four of them, quotes from four of them, and then you can talk about them uh, after I present what they have, what's their contribution. So for Johann Baptist Metz, it's a German Christian theologian. Um, uh, this is a quote from his Christians and Jews after Auschwitz. He said, Christians are from now on assigned to the victims of Auschwitz, assigned, in fact, in an alliance belonging to the very heart of saving history. Jews and Christians could arrive one day at a coalition of messianic trust in opposition to the apotheosis of banality and hatred present in the world. So, for Baptist Metz, you know, there can no longer be a movement of, there can no longer be theology without the victims of Auschwitz. So basically, saying that you know, we are intertwined historically, and so we have to move together uh, in history. Another one is, of course, Gustavo Gutierrez, Peruvian liberation theologian, who speaks about the suffering of the innocent, and which is another movement in history, would be, because it's not only that Western Christianity oppressed the Jews, but also Western Christianity was also responsible for the oppression of those it conquered, uh, like Latin America, Africa, Asia. So here, Gustavo Gutierrez is, and this is a quote from his book on Job, which I have a copy and I actually read a couple of months ago. So he said, how are we to talk about a God who is revealed as love in a situation characterized by poverty and oppression? How are we to proclaim that the God of life to men and women who die prematurely and unjustly? How are we to acknowledge that God makes us a free gift of love and justice when we have before us the suffering of the innocent? And you also say why, you know, why Elie Wiesel really feels close to Gustavo Gutierrez. And then we have Carter Hayward. And you quoted from her book, Revolutionary Forgiveness, Feminist Reflections in Nicaragua. And actually, I was also very surprised, because I thought you developed the idea of revolutionary forgiveness in the book that you wrote in 2000, but actually it was already here in your Beyond Innocence and Redemption. I mean, 10 years before the writing of that book, Revolutionary Forgiveness. And so here, a quote from that book from Carter Hayward: people cannot simply forgive. So in the context of moving into history and the place of forgiveness, people cannot simply forgive, invite back into their lives on a mutual basis those who continue to do harm to them and their people. We do not believe that any of us can forgive those who continue to violate us. Otherwise, forgiveness is an empty word. And this is in the context of, you know, the victims of torture and summary killings in Nicaragua, uh, which when she took her student to the Nicaragua in order to understand what's happening there. Forgiveness is possible only when the violence stops. Only then can those who have been violated even consider the possibility of actually loving those who once brutalized and battered them. Only then can the former victims empower the victimizers by helping them to realize their own power to live as liberated liberators. People able to see in themselves and others a corporate capacity to shape the future. And lastly, you went back to Rosemary Ruder, on her prophetic hope in her book, The Wrath of Jonah. It is by keeping human hopes and ideals as critical measuring rods to judge historical reality, rather than using them as ideological self-sacralization, that one keeps redemptive hopes from being turned into false messianism. So these four Christians represent a renewal that is needed for that moving forward into history.
Yes, and very wonderfully, all of them, the victims of Auschwitz, revolutionary forgiveness, the messianic, critiquing the messianic as a form of a kind of a messianism, which is different. So these Christian theologians, all of whom I've met or know quite well and traveled with, are very instructive for Jews and others, of course.
But you said that among the four, it was only Rosemary Ruder who was very clear in terms of that critical solidarity that you were, not silencing dissent.
Well, yeah, the others, of course, Gustavo was in Latin America where there are very few Jews. Metz was a German. Germans are very unlikely to talk about Israel Palestine in a critical way. And Carter Hayward, who I did get and note this idea of revolutionary forgiveness from, uh, stopped in a sense at Elie Wiesel. She knows of my work and has told me that it's important, but it's very difficult for Christians to cross that barrier into a very critical understanding in public of Israel Palestine. Partly because they might be accused of anti-Semitism by the Jewish establishment, partly because progressive Jews were very important supporters of their movements and they didn't want to alienate them, and partly because of their sense of the history of Christian anti-Semitism. So very difficult. Rosemary's the only one, really, who went full force and without hesitation once she realized it, and held the two together. Again, she's the light there.
Why do you think she is able to do that? I mean, what does she know that the other three wouldn't know?
It's not much what you know. Sometimes it's what you know and what you don't know, and sometimes it's personality, and sometimes it's a certain kind of courage, which you don't think of as courage. What separates me from Waskow and Lerner and that crowd? I don't know. It's not intelligence. It's not. There may be certain experiences I've had, or they had, or didn't have. I don't know what was it about Benjamin and Hannah Arendt and Martin Buber. Could be their superior intelligence and stuff, but there are plenty of intelligent people, and so we don't know what it is that allows certain people to go for it, and those certain people to hold back. And some of it is fear. I would never think of it as courage, although that's applied often, because in my own life, I just saw it and did it, and I don't think of it as courage. And I could see Rosemary as courageous, but she wouldn't say that about herself. So I don't know.
Yeah, because in terms of course, I mean, Gustavo Gutierrez would have that would have a lot of but I think sometimes and this is not no this is no there's no theoretical backup to this. Sometimes you just move ahead and then without really thinking so much about what is at stake here, or sometimes you don't even know what is at stake here, and you
Yeah,
just
but
you move it, and then later on you learn more, and then you decide to move forward or you backtrack.
yeah, well, if you look at the Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation, published in '87, and Beyond Innocence and Redemption, published in 1990, this is just 3 years. But if you look at the two books, the advancement and the insight and the history is so different. Why? How? So we don't know. I just say that in history, we read people, we meet people, and we read people who just moved forward. And as you know, I love 1,000-page biographies. And at the end of it, you just say, wow, you still can't pinpoint it. I leave it at that. What was it about Walter Benjamin, Hannah Arendt, Einstein? What was the insight that gave Einstein a theory that is still proved over and over again as accurate? And he had nothing like we have now. What was it about him? We always talk about the brilliance of Einstein. Obviously, he was brilliant, but that's not enough. What holds people back?
But now the situation is different, because now you have to be pro-Palestine, or to be able to be considered a progressive, right?
Well, those are constituency conversions, as I discussed last time. That's not relevant in what we're discussing. You have to ask on the breakthroughs, you have to accept them and you have to follow them. You're going to never know why that person was that breakthrough. But it's fascinating to try to understand it, especially if that's part of your life. But you're not going to be rewarded with it. The rewards are different. I mean, Einstein got a Nobel Prize, but not for his discussion of Zionism.
Yeah.
And Hannah Arendt rewarded with her name being touted, but she was also hit hard by the Jewish establishment. Buber was rewarded in certain ways and hit. So Benjamin didn't get much reward at all, and he was hit. So,
you didn't really mention him, but you mentioned him, but didn't really go into depth. Kafka, Franz Kafka, also part of that hidden tradition.
Sure.
Can you talk about his Jewishness?
Well, that's a long story, and I've read biography after biography of Kafka, and a wonderful 3-volume biography of Kafka just recently over the last years. Grew up in basically a kind of a secular religious culture and minority, and discovered his Jewishness through certain encounters. This is a long story. Was also basically a non-Zionist. There were people who wanted to bring him to Palestine too. He's a whole nother story that you could write about in this. So Jewish, and yet was discovering his Jewishness, and people talk about him as if he wasn't Jewish, which you can't understand him without that. That's a whole nother story. Why was Kafka Kafka? And of course, basically unknown in his life. And became an icon later. I've read 2,000 or 3,000 pages of biography of Kafka, and a fascinating story about his Jewishness too, and his attraction to Jewishness and his learning of Hebrew at the end of his life, or trying to, and another tradition.
Yeah. Although his views about Israel Palestine, of course, probably during that time, it's not yet,
It's not Israel. He's interested, and he has some correspondence. He doesn't write anything special about it. Doesn't seem to have a definite view, but he's not going.
Okay. So we have, and then of course, aside from the Christians, you said that the very important part of this movement in history would be, of course, the Palestinians and here you mentioned Naimatik's again work and Atik's approach allows a process of insight and activity that moves beyond an ethic of retribution toward a future of mutual involvement, recognition, and ultimately integration. He allows Jews to feel the birth of a Jewish state was necessary if they also admit that from the Palestinian perspective it was also wrong. Atik forces both sides to discard the ideological blinders that mask a false messianism. Jews are no longer innocent. Palestinians will not reclaim all of Palestine. So very important. So now you have this, the Trinity. Uh, you have Jews of conscience, and you have Christians of conscience, and then you have the Palestinians uh, of conscience. Although very, I think, very difficult for Palestinians to uh, go this route or this path, but you see hope, at least in Naimatik's views and position.
Yes, my relationship with him since 1987, when he heard me speak in Jerusalem, has been a significant encounter in my life and maybe in his life too. And that's a long story, which we recalled in my biographical segments. But in his Palestinian theology of liberation, which I helped bring back to the United States and helped get published, and I worked with him on it. And then we spoke many times around the world together. Very controversial, my involvement with him. Very controversial, his involvement with me. In terms of the interfaith ecumenical movement of solidarity, maybe one of the most significant relationships in that history, because Palestine, Israel-Palestine, became so important in the interfaith ecumenical deal. So we helped break that with Rosemary and some others, but we were at the forefront of it. And I learned from him, and he learned from me. And we realized that we had to negotiate our histories as we tried to integrate them, and that both were part of our histories now. Jews were part of Palestinian history. Palestinian history was part of Jewish history, and there was no going back, and there was a good way going forward. And at that time, it was a recognition of a Jewish and Palestinian state with bridges that would be built over time. I still think that's probably the best way to initiate it, although it's gone as a possibility. And also theologically beginning to understand our relationships as Jews and Christians in another way. Obviously, Naimatik is a Middle Eastern Christian, and then my meetings with Middle Eastern Christians and my publication of Beyond Innocence and Redemption in Arabic through the Middle East Council of Churches. Anyway, it's all together in a failed opportunity, but a very important one as now part of the hidden tradition of Jewish life too, and maybe of Palestinian life.
My question is, why not a Muslim theologian? Why like, I mean, why is there no Muslim theologian?
Well, that's very important. For the contact in the United States and Europe, it was mostly through Palestinian Christians. And that was more available to European and American theologians, especially at that time. And the Muslim theologians or Muslim religious were mostly unknown in the West in the 1980s and the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. And the Muslim population of Europe and the United States was also beginning to increase. So there's much more knowledge and more contact now than there was then. But in general, Palestinian Christians have been the interlocutors with European Christians, American Christians, and American Jews. So that's a limitation, but that was the bridge. When you got into Islam in the Middle East, it was very foreign to European and American Christians and Jews. And also there were more limitations on them. Their experience of the West had been less, but they were also more involved in the Middle East, which at that time was much less agreeable to these movements with Jews and Christians. So that's a very complex story, a very important story that hasn't been told. But that was the conduit for Jews like me and Christians in the United States and Europe, was through Palestinian Christians, Elias Shakur, Naim Atik, Mitri Rahab. It still is mostly, and that's a bridge and also a limitation.
Although you mentioned in the book, uh, but I don't know if they're particularly speaking from for a Muslim standpoint, is Dr. Muhammad Halaj.
Yeah, I had interactions with Muslims, both in traveling to the Middle East and with Muhammad Halaj, who is very wonderful man. And I met him many years ago and gave talks with him, and he published some of my work. And I had contact with Muslims in Jordan when I traveled there, and Syria, and Lebanon, and of course, Egypt. And so I've had those contacts, but bringing the message home in a way that I could understand it and others could understand it was mostly through Christians. And of course, Muhammad Al-Hajj was a good secular Muslim.
Yeah, yeah, that's also what, because I was also thinking about that, because yes, maybe they are, maybe they identify themselves as Muslims, but do they speak from tradition when they talk about?
Muhammad Al-Hajj and I had a personal relationship, and not so much a sharing of ideas. We shared our encounters. It was actually very important for me. And I don't really know his religiosity. He certainly didn't speak as a religious Muslim. I don't know that he isn't religious. Uh, yeah, that's another series of questions. But my experience of Muslims who are not religious is that they're secular in a way that Jews are secular. There's something specific about them, but they're not overtly religious. It's quite a beautiful encounter, series of encounters. I've also had encounters with strictly religious Muslims all over the world and have spoken in mosques. And that's also quite, but I haven't written about that much. And they're not writing as much, or I'm not familiar as much with their writing. So my sphere has been more limited. But it was also extremely controversial, my association with Naim Atik and Palestinian Christians, but also groundbreaking.
Okay. We're coming to the end. And so the last part of chapter 6 is this, where you bring it together, and this is the theology that is needed for this critical time, and you outline the political and theological framework for this theology, which for you has two very main components. One is the absolutization of Israel and the Holocaust, where Israel becomes at one level a state like any other state, capable of being good and bad, but unworthy of ultimate loyalty, and where a major element of a critical relationship with the state is to help bring the Jewish people into closer proximity to the Palestinian people. And so for you, it's important that the Palestinians have a say on the Jewish state, but also what does that mean, and what do they? Of course, if they will have their own state, and then what would be the relationship? Or if it's going to be one state, how would that play out? And then the second major component would be the refashioning of Jewish identity, not by bypassing the formative events of Jewish history, that is the Holocaust and the creation of the State of Israel, but by re-evaluating them in the light of Jewish experience of suffering and power. And you and the last and the in conclusion, so you wrote this actually short afterward about the task before us, and uh, and you said that there's little to celebrate and much to lament at the 40th anniversary of the creation of Israel in 1988. And this is something very prophetic. You said that 10 years later, of course, you wrote the book in 1989 and it was published in 1990. And you said that in 10 years after that uh, 40th celebration, the 50th celebration represents a forbidding challenge where the fundamental and by 1998 the fundamental choice would have been made. It's either to continue the expansion and militarism or to embark on a new road. And so that the task before us is neither soothing or encouraging. Uh, so only a confrontation with state power and legitimating force of that power, Zionism and Holocaust theology hold forth the prospect of a faithfulness that is Jewish in context and efficacious in reality. And so you were right.
No, I was I was right. By the 1990s, by 2000, with the second uprising, it was over, and maybe it was over before then too. Uh, uh, but
So you were not optimistic in closing. Yeah, at the end of this
well,
book, you were.
I, I I still had, if you look at the writing of Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation and Beyond Innocence and Redemption, I still thought that there was a possibility. I didn't really know what the possibility was, or I didn't think it through, except that I saw it closing. Maybe it had already closed, and maybe it had closed many years before then, but it certainly closed during this time period that I predicted. Uh, and that means the task before us, once it's closed, is even darker. And there's less room to maneuver. But the formative events, as we de-absolutize Israel and the Holocaust, yes, that's been done among Jews of conscience. And as we look toward a future which is foreclosed now, where do we stand? It has to be Jewish in context and in particularity and open to the world. And what does that mean concretely? I've written much since this book, but the concrete way of moving toward it, toward what I envision, is less and less available, and that's less and less available to speak about or write about without being philosophical in a very abstract way. If you're Jewish, everything is at stake here. As a citizen, there are many things of the United States or Europe or Arab world. There are many things at stake: the environment, immigration, empowerment of the cities, economy. That's shared by all of us in different ways. But what is at stake for Jews is Jewishness. That's our center. Without that center, we don't contribute to the world, really. That's our basis for contributing fully to the world. And now our Jewishness is soiled with what the state of Israel has done and is doing to the Palestinian people and will continue to do. And we search for a way out, but there isn't a way out. There's only a way through. So I continue. Obviously, I could not write again with this passion as I did in Beyond Innocence and Redemption. I could only do that once. And going through this with you, hour after hour after hour, both relives the intensity of that moment and the fact that I can't do it again, and I will never go through it again. I can't do it. But
Maybe on the 40th anniversary, maybe we can do another.
I'm done with Beyond Innocence and Redemption. But revisiting it with you has shown me how this continues to be the basis for any movement. And that what's been written after, in my view, has added to it, has expanded it, but has not replaced it. And I can't.
Sometimes it has been reduced to just some of it. And in
Of
fact,
course.
yeah.
Of course. Yeah. Well, sometimes you even begin to believe the reduction that others make of you. So going through this quote by quote, text by text, and over a significant amount of time has reintroduced me to the Marc Ellis that hasn't been reduced. Because you reduce things in order to communicate over time and to explore the unreduced text, which most people haven't read. They just see me as a symbol, positive or negative.
Well, we might call this the unabridged, Jewish liberation theology. I think the three, the theology towards the Jewish theology of liberation, beyond innocence and ending Auschwitz, that's the unabridged Jewish theology of liberation.
I think that's true. And if you look at any theologian or any writer, you have a certain time. Usually it's within a decade of time that their most explosive work is written. And Toward a Jewish Theology of Liberation was published in 87. Beyond Innocence and Redemption, 1990. Ending Auschwitz in 2004. And Unholy Alliance, Religion and Atrocity in Our Time, 1997. So you have within a decade what I have to say. Now, I've said other things, and I think some of it's interesting and important, but this was the intense period of my intellectual life in writing on Jewish matters. And I stand and fall on that decade. But if you look at other writers, you'll see that basically, if you're lucky, there's a decade. Sometimes it's only 5 years or 3 years or for most, none at all.
And I think most intellectuals like yourself suffer from so much reductionism that at the end, you were just described, in one or two sentences, what you have written for decades.
Yeah, when I'm remembered at all, I'm described in a passing reference. I get it. Anyway, that's part of life and part of our situation. But it's important to recall, in my view, this book on the 30th anniversary. And I'm very grateful for the time I've spent with you doing this, although this is the absolute last time I will ever do it. Remember, these words that I wrote, which are so much a part of my life, are also carriers of trauma for Palestinians, for Jews, and for me personally. So when you write something that's explosive and right to the bone, there's a lot of stuff that happens after, and part of it is trauma. And yet it was also part of the fulfillment of my life. So we have both. So I'm grateful.
And so with that, I'd like to express my gratitude as well. It's been what a ride. It's such an honor and privilege to be able to go through this with you. I have discovered the book as really it's really explosive, and I come out of it so enhanced and enlarged, and I feel more able to enter the Jewish history through your work. So thank you so much, Professor Ellis, for your generous. I know this is very traumatic for you, and the hours. I think I haven't made the count, but we probably have spent 10 hours at least doing this, and maybe more. So I know it's difficult, but thank you so much for your generosity. Again, just like Buber and Hannah Arendt, and you are very generous uh, with others. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Coy. Been almost as much energy doing this as writing the book, but I'm very glad to revisit it for the last time. So thank you.